Reading today from John 21, verses 1 through 19. After these things, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias. He showed himself in this way. Gathered there together were Simon Peter, Thomas called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and two others of his disciples. Simon Peter said to them, "I am going fishing." They said to him, "We will go with you." They went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Just after daybreak, Jesus stood on the beach, but the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to them, "Children, you have no fish, have you?" They answered him, "No." He said to them, "Cast the net to the right side of the boat, and you will find some." So they cast it, and now they were not able to haul it in because there were so many fish. The disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." When Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on some clothes, for he was naked, and jumped into the sea. But the other disciples came in the boat, dragging the net full of fish, for they were not far from the land, only about 100 yards off. When they had gone ashore, they saw a charcoal fire there, with fish on it and bread. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish that you have just caught." So Simon Peter went aboard and hauled the net ashore, full of fish, 153 of them. And though there were so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." Now none of the disciples dared to ask him, "Who are you?" because they knew it was the Lord. Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them and did the same with the fish. This was now the third time that Jesus had appeared to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. When they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my lambs." A second time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Tend my sheep." He said to him the third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter felt hurt because he said to him the third time, "Do you love me?" And he said to him, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep. Very truly I tell you, when you were younger, you used to fasten your own belt and go wherever you wished. But when you grow old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will fasten a belt around you and take you where you do not wish to go." He said this to indicate the kind of death by which he would glorify God. After this, he said to him, "Follow me." This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. One of my favorite movies, and one of my and many people's favorite character in a movie to imitate, is Forrest Gump. Such a classic movie with many great scenes and memorable moments. But one particular moment of the movie is both hilarious and illustrative about Peter in this passage. As you recall the movie, after the war, Forrest decides he's going to go and be a shrimp boat captain. But when he decided that, he told Lieutenant Dan he was going to do it, and Lieutenant Dan said, "If you ever go to be a shrimp boat captain," imagine him saying with this all doubt in his mind, "If you ever go to be a shrimp boat captain, I'll be your first mate." Well, sure enough, later in the movie, we see Forrest, and he's driving along on his boat, and all of a sudden he looks off into the distance. And then he jumps into the boat, "Lieutenant Dan, And he swims as hard as he can. He doesn't even turn off the boat. He's swimming. He crawls up the ladder to the dock, and he says, "Lieutenant Dan, what are you doing here?" And he says, "Well, Forrest, I thought I'd try out my sea legs." "But you ain't got no legs, Lieutenant Dan." And then we see the boat sliding by, floating by in the background, and all of a sudden the boat crashes in to the dock. And as calm as he could be, Forrest looks at Lieutenant Dan and says, "That's my boat." Peter was so excited to see Jesus that he jumps out of the boat and swam as fast as he could to be with Jesus. Jesus was there waiting for him and the other disciples with a meal, fish, bread over an open flame on the beach. Anybody want to be there right now? So many of Jesus' intimate and sacred moments happen over a meal, and here comes another one with Peter. After they had finished eating breakfast, a memorable conversation happens, one of the most memorable in all of Scripture. Jesus takes Peter. I can just imagine him putting his arm around him and just saying, "Let's go for a walk." They go for this long walk on the beach, and Jesus doesn't even warm up with small talk. He just jumps right in. "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Oh, a punch to the gut for Peter. "You're questioning my love, Jesus? Of course, you know that I love you." And this happens not just once, but 3 more times, corresponding to, thinking back to the 3 times Peter denied Christ. But what's interesting is that each time Peter said he loved Jesus, Jesus didn't shout hooray and pat him on the back. He gave him a job to do. Jesus is commissioning Peter and letting him know it's time for him to step up and learn how to shepherd the flock. Jesus is sharing his work, his ministry with Peter. But even further, Jesus is asking about Peter's love for him to remind Peter and to confirm for Peter the love that Peter has for Jesus as he begins this journey. And it also instills that as followers of Christ, love is behind every work and every ministry that we do. N.T. Wright puts it so beautifully, and he says, "Here is the secret of all Christian ministry. Yours and mine lay and ordained. It's the secret of everything from being a quiet back row member of a prayer group to being a platform speaker at huge rallies and conferences. If you're going to do any single solitary thing as a follower or servant of Jesus Christ, this is what it's built on. Somewhere deep down inside, there is a love for Jesus, and though you've let him down enough times, he wants to find that love, to give you a chance to express it, to heal the hurts and failures of the past, and give you new work to do." Jesus has seen Peter's all-or-nothing attitude throughout the Gospels, all his life. Peter didn't always say the best thing or do the right thing, but whatever we did, we could always count on Peter to do everything with all his might, even jump out of a boat to be with Jesus. So because of all this, Jesus wasn't worried about Peter working hard, but he wanted to ensure that Peter knew that all he did, the ministry, the work, was not coming from a selfish ambition or motive, but it was coming out of his love for Jesus. Acknowledging our love for God isn't the end of our faith journey, but only the beginning, as we experience with baptism. In order for love to mean something, an expression of that love is needed. As we begin our faith journey, one of the greatest acts of ministry and acts of love that we can partake in is just exactly what Peter's doing, and that is feeding the sheep. If we love Jesus, our lives must reflect what we have. Our lives aren't lived to earn or prove God's love for us. As we know, we could never do enough. We're going to fail. We're going to fall short. We're going to be wrong. But that's the radical part of the gospel and the way God chose to bring God's kingdom to this world. Jesus has come and chosen a bunch of folks who are broken and who fail to change the world. So many people look at their lives and think they aren't good enough, think they don't have anything to offer. But what's so sad is that paralyzes them rather than freeing them up to know that Jesus has come. What a sad thing. But look at Peter's past. He always is quick to stick his foot in his mouth. He was rebuked by Jesus. He denied Jesus 3 times and abandoned him at the cross. And guess what? Jesus is now commissioning Peter to follow him. What a huge, huge message of love. Imagine Peter's emotions in that moment. He knows he's messed up, but Jesus is still putting his trust in him to tend the flock. Jesus is doing the same thing with us. None of us are more important than the other, but we are all called to tend the flock in some way. This is the joy and responsibility of adhering to the priesthood of all believers, soul competency, great Baptist tenets that we love to rely on. We are all responsible for one another. This is what we call a church, a pen full of sheep in need of shepherding, and we all shepherd one another. This is why we have discussions and make church-wide decisions rather than receiving commands from up top. We want to make sure that we are paying respect to and honoring the thoughts and beliefs of every sheep in the pen. We keep each other accountable, we challenge one another, we celebrate with one another, we comfort one another, and we grieve with one another. We need each other. Because without each other, we're alone, and life isn't meant to be lived alone. We need God. We need each other. We need the community in order to grow into the person and the people God has created us to be. I heard a very defining statement about the church in a recent conversation I was having with a church member. We were talking about how we can often lose our focus about what the church is, and it becomes about us, about me, rather than about us. This person said something that really struck me, and I'll never forget what they said. He said, "You may wake up on a Sunday morning not feeling like going to church because you may not need it that day. But guess what? There's somebody in the church who is going to need you to be at church because they're not having a good week. And they are hurting. And they need you to be there, whether you need to be there or not." Isn't that what Jesus means by tending the sheep? Paul did say, when one part of the body suffers, the whole body suffers. When one part rejoices, the whole body rejoices. This is why we worship together, but it's even more why we have Sunday school classes. It would be impossible for one person to care for every single person in this church. It's a large church. But we have these groups so we can tend to their individual needs. We spend time together getting to know one another. We're at their births of their children. We're at the deaths of friends and loved ones. We work together to find sheep outside of our particular flock to tend to, because although we exist to feed and tend to one another, we're also called to tend to those who are outside of our flock. Principalities and powers are ruling the world, creating systems of poverty, injustice, and we're to help tend those affected by the system as well as transform the system. As individuals, we may not be able to change the whole system, but we can help those who are a part of it and be present in their lives because they are crying out for help. This week I read a story about a missionary in Uganda. He had been in many orphanages before, but he was in this particular orphanage in Uganda, and he walked into this nursery of 100 baby cribs. All of them were full, and he heard the strangest noise that you can hear in a nursery full of 100 babies. Silence. A sound beyond rare So he looked at the attendant and said, "Why is this room silent? There are 100 babies in this room." She looked at him and said, "After about a week of them being here and crying out for countless hours, they eventually stop when they realize no one's coming for them." Folks, people all around us are crying out for help. It may be because of injustice, and most definitely it's because of pain and because they're crying out for our help. As followers of Christ, it's our responsibility, our calling to feed and care for these people. We don't ever want to get to the point where people become silent and give up on the church, or even worse, give up on God. We're called to tend the flock. One thing I love about the interaction with Jesus and Peter is that Jesus doesn't say how Peter's supposed to go about doing this. Jesus is calling Peter to simply follow him, devote his life to Jesus. Feed, tend, feed. Some might feel that Jesus left us hanging by not telling Peter or us how to take care of these sheep or tend the flock. Maybe he was speaking literally. We're to feed people. There is most definitely a need for this interpretation in the world. There are people who are starving all around us, all across the world, and we need this literal interpretation. There are some who feel called to this, but then there are people who are called to many other things. It can be expressed in many different ways according to the passions and gifts of each individual person. Some are called to be pastors, teachers, preachers, evangelists, doctors, lawyers, politicians, I think. Point being is that no matter what we do, we should be doing it to tend the flock out of our love for Christ. Not just because it's the right thing to do, not just to make the world a better place. Those are good things, but only come from a love for Christ. Because we love Jesus, we can't help but love the flock and work for what's best for the whole, not just what's best for us, to keep ourselves comfortable and out of danger or pain. When we love deeply, we will naturally do things that put ourselves at risk. But when we are tending the flock, one thing is certain. We live for the best of the whole, not just for ourselves, no matter the difficulty, because Jesus made the way of love for us first. Do you love him? Follow him. Amen.